Hey guys, welcome to our first recorded notes. Be sure to stop this video at any point if you need to go back and listen to what I said again or to write something down. That's the beauty of having these recorded, so you can go back whenever you need to. So for chapter 1, we're going to focus on Native Americans pre and post contact with Europeans. We're also going to take a look at European exploration of the Americas and compare various nations' approaches to their exploration and, in some cases, conquest of the Americas. These are the must-knows of Chapter 1. Your American pageant textbook does a really good job of laying out what you're expected to take away from the chapter, so be sure that you look at that before you start your reading assignments. This is an example of what I'm talking about from Chapter 5. It lays out simply the must-know events and people, and then it tells you kind of the key concepts that are included in this chapter, and it even helps you with some historical thinking skills. So as much as a lot of kids want to skip over this, I would really recommend looking at this before you start reading a new chapter, because it's telling you exactly the main points that you need to be pulling out of it. Because a lot of the textbook is kind of filler information that you don't necessarily exactly need to know for the test. So pay attention to this. This is a big hint for how to be successful with your textbook readings. When humans originally inhabited this planet, they originated in Africa, but slowly migrated to different parts of the world, like Europe and Asia. Specifically, America was inhabited by people that migrated from Asia using this land bridge on the Bering Strait during an ice age. And they likely crossed because they were following various animals that they hunted across that section. And it was a really gradual migration, but eventually the populations of North America grew to several million as the years went on. This is just a map that shows how native tribes fed themselves, essentially. The purple areas indicate people that were primarily sedentary, meaning that they stayed in the same place, and they often farmed in addition to hunting. And the green and orange areas are indicating areas that were more mobile. So these groups would focus more of their energies on hunting and would move around a little bit more to find different sources of food. And this is going to be especially true once horses are introduced into North America. Tribes like the Lakota are going to really take to the horse and move away from farming into this kind of mobile hunting lifestyle. So we're going to take a look at a few tribes before Columbus arrived. Oftentimes, students have this preconceived notion that native peoples were very sparsely populated across North and South America and that they weren't very advanced. But in fact, that's really not the case. For example, the Inca had over 25,000 kilometers of roadway systems and had a version of a postal system in which mail could be brought from one area to another along these roads, and they farmed maize, aka corn, that they had developed from an entirely different grain crop sort of thing. And there were also the Aztec, which was another really sophisticated group living under the empire. And you'll see the stats that I posted there that Europe in its entirety totaled about 60 million at this time, and the Aztec alone had 20 million people living under their rule. So that's pretty significant. So now turning to North America, tribes from the southwest areas of the country, so present day New Mexico and Arizona, were again very complicated societies that primarily farmed, and they developed irrigation systems for their crops. They inhabited places like caves, areas under cliffs, and in some cases they had multi-story buildings, which again people don't typically think about when they think about native cultures. This group did have a lot of drought and famine though, and they fought a lot with groups nearby, so a lot of these tribes were already somewhat diminished by the time the Europeans arrived. The Northwest settlements had a different mode of operation. They primarily focused on hunting and fishing and gathering foods that were naturally occurring around them. However, what made this region really unique was the fact that the mountains around them kept them really isolated, and it barred them from developing certain technologies like some other tribes had. The Great Plains people were primarily nomadic hunters or sedentary people who farmed and traded in regions like the Dakotas and some places in Minnesota. The Great Plains people were nomadic hunters or sedentary people who farmed and traded. And the buffalo was very important to both of those groups. The group that did farm focused their agriculture on the Three Sisters, so that's the corn, beans, and squash growing together in a certain combo to protect the other crops. The corn stalk would be kind of the place for the beans to scale it, and the squash leaves shaded out weeds. After the introduction of horses by the Spanish settlers, however, a lot of the wild horses were captured and tamed by native peoples and were incorporated into their lifestyle, which in turn made them more mobile. The Northeast settlement, so around the New York State region of the country, combined, farming and hunting. The farming techniques exhausted the soil, however, very quickly, so they had to move around quite a lot. They lived in long houses that were often ruled by a matriarch, and it's what we call a matrilineal society, meaning that the women often had more influential leadership roles than the men. And this region also had the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a really big political union of independent tribes that would meet together to defeat warring tribes or handle any other business or issues concerning the tribes. So, those were the Native American tribes before the Europeans arrived. We're now going to talk about why the Europeans decided that they needed to explore in the first place, and then we'll focus on the impacts of that exploration. As you will hopefully remember from your world history class, the Crusades were a series of military campaigns in which the Catholic Church tried and failed to take Jerusalem back from the Islamic Turks. Again, this was ultimately a failure for the Catholics, but it did make Europe more aware of what was out in the world, and it helped them to expand their economic systems of trade. Cities expanded during this time because Europe was moving away from the feudal system in which, groups of people would live on a specific property and would be really self-contained there for their entire lives. So, think about serfs working on the land of a lord. Many people, though, were starting to move away from that and to live in cities, which is going to make, this middle class and people start using money rather than trading goods. Due to this increased awareness of the world, people decided that they wanted to get their hands on all of these goods. So monarchs started to look into a way to circumvent the middleman on the Silk Road to find their own path to Asia and to get the goods that they wanted. So they would hopefully do this quicker and cheaper. And this is going to be possible in part because of the advances in technology and shipbuilding during the time and certain tools that were used for mariners or people who were sailors. So, to sum everything up that we just said, these are the 6 major reasons/events that led to an expansion in European exploration. So, the Crusades led to an increased awareness. People wanted to bypass the middleman, which led to this Renaissance period in which Europeans want to know more about the world. And as they learned more about the world, people wanted to colonize and change/save the native peoples that were living there and to convert them to Christianity. Governments also wanted to get in on the action and to get money and resources from these places, which was all made possible because of technological advances. And the fame and fortune wouldn't hurt. So, to simplify it even further, some teachers will describe this as the 3 G's. So, glory, gold, and God. It doesn't really matter the order, but this class doesn't really frame things that way. So, an A push, understanding of this would be political, economic, and religious reasons for exploration. The political being that they wanted to have more influence throughout the world and more power by gaining new territory and resources. The economic reasons, again, were because they wanted to get a hold of those Asian goods that were going to benefit the countries monetarily. And they wanted to break the stronghold of Islam in the world and to spread their own Christian beliefs. So that would be the religious aspect. So I'm not going to expect you to know this for the test, but I just want to make a point here. A lot of students think that Columbus landed on the continental United States. But as you can see from this map, that is not the case. Columbus got very close, but he did not actually land on the continental United States. Instead, he landed on places like the Bahamas, the Canary Islands, Hispaniola, Cuba, South America, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. In many cases, Columbus was extremely ruthless to the people that he encountered living on these islands. In 130 years, 95% of the people living in North and South America are going to be wiped out by diseases that were carried by the Europeans and from the brutality that they suffered at the hands of the people that were conquering the Americas. Which leads us to the Columbian Exchange, which is defined as the transfer of goods, ideas, diseases between America, Europe, and Africa. Oftentimes, people just classify this as the Old World and the New World, with the Old World meaning Europe and the New World meaning the Americas. So, what did the Europeans gain from the Americas in this? Well, they gained a lot of new plants like the potatoes and corn, new animals like turkeys, etc. And these new plants are going to allow for a huge increase in European populations. And the native people acquired new crops like wheat and sugarcane, and they also acquired the horse, which was really influential, like we said earlier, as some of the Plains tribes adopted it. But they also had a lot of diseases that would be catastrophic to their populations. It was not intentional on the part of the Europeans to spread the diseases, but many native peoples had never come into contact with them like the Europeans had, so they didn't have any built-up resistance. Once Columbus had made his quote-unquote discovery, other European countries wanted in on the action and began fighting for dominance in the New World. Those being Spain, England, France, and Portugal. And this is going to lead to a lot of fighting of wars between both Europeans and native populations and Europeans with Europeans. The Spanish were the first to actually try and make permanent settlements, also known as colonization. This began in the Caribbean and spread to Central and South America. So we're talking about conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro that would come over to, dominate the native peoples living there. The first permanent European settlement in what is today the United States was actually, made by the Spanish and not the English, as we are sometimes led to believe as kids. Spain gained a lot of gold and silver from the Americas, which is something that they greatly desired. As you can see here, Spain made quick work of the Americas as well. So all of the areas indicated in that darker brown were controlled by the Spanish. The gold color is the Portuguese, and it's indicating some other empires. I mentioned a couple of slides ago about how this attempted dominance of North America and South America would lead to some clashes, most importantly between Europeans and Native Americans. A major problem with the two of them is that they disagreed so strongly on so many points, such as how they viewed land ownership. Europeans viewed land as something that you used to get things that you wanted for economic gain, and it was something that could be bought or sold. The more land that you owned, the more wealthy you were. And the Native Americans just didn't see it that way. They believed that the environment was something to be protected, that belonged to everyone, and it was something that everyone was a part of, and it wasn't something you could just own. And that isn't to say that Native Americans never altered the natural environment, because they did, but they usually did so in a more conservative manner. Europeans, by contrast, would completely clear the land, ridding it of all of the trees, etc., for farming, and often this would destroy a natural area for animals to live in, which made it difficult for hunting because animals no longer lived there without that tree and foliage for protection. So this disagreement is going to lead to a lot of problems in the future. Historians have broken down the patterns of colonization into 5 steps. The first being exploration, where people like Columbus would attempt to find new places. And after they found these lands, nations would send over conquistadors that would attempt to conquer native populations living there. Once the natives were in a manageable state, the Europeans would send over missionaries to convert the native peoples. After that, they would send over colonists, women and children, to settle these new territories and eventually form the colonial empires that we're familiar with today. During the missionary phase, the encomienda system was put into place under the Spanish rule. Conquistadors would force native people to work on their lands doing manual labor for little to no payment. It's a system that's often thought of as similar to slavery. It's not quite the same because native peoples were allowed to go home at night, but they were treated very poorly and exploited. In exchange for this labor, the conquistadors were supposed to protect the people that they were taking care of and convert them to Christianity, and make sure that they were able to live off of their lands, but it often didn't work out this way. The system had a very negative impact on the native populations. Some Spaniards were outraged by the treatment of these native peoples, and one such man was Bartolome de las Casas. He was a Spanish priest that had seen firsthand this poor treatment of these people and spoke to the king about it, and eventually was able to convince the king to pass what are called the new laws that would limit the poor treatment, of native peoples in the colonies. How well this series of laws were enforced, that's not very clear, but just to again recap, De las Casas is someone that we're going to be reading a primary source by, but again, he spoke out about the poor treatment of Native Americans and wanted them to be treated better. However, ironically, his solution to this problem was to import African slaves to use in place of Native Americans. So, we'll see this often in history where some of these people who we perceive to be good people do things that don't quite make sense with our modern understanding, but ultimately he was fighting for the greater good for native peoples anyway. Unfortunately, though, not for African slaves. Which leads us to the slave trade. So this is something that was already going on in Africa for hundreds of years between different groups of people living in Africa. It was kind of a different system, though. I think a lot of historians have argued that slaves were not treated as poorly in Africa. And initially, Spaniards and Europeans had hoped that the native people would be able to produce the labor that was needed in the colonies. But after all of the native people started dying from disease, it became clear that this was not going to be the group of people that would be able to take care of that. So they were going to need a different group of people to make up that labor force. Which brings us back to the African slaves. Many of the slaves had a built-up resistance to the diseases that had wiped out the Native Americans. So to a lot of Europeans, it seemed like a logical choice. Slaves were being brought over to the Americas less than 30 years after Columbus initially discovered the Americas. And between the 16th and 19th centuries, about 10 million African people are going to be shipped to the Americas to be used as slaves. This is just a map showing the general routes of the transatlantic slave trade. The Spanish were not the only ones to settle North America. The French also had their hand in it. They primarily focused on the northern regions of Northern America, like Canada and the northern US, but they weren't focused on building permanent settlements. They were more interested in developing the fur trade and being able to get those furs in and out of regions using waterways like the St. Lawrence River, which gave them access to the inside of the continent and to the ocean. And the French historically had a much better relationship with Native Americans than the Spanish. Often they would marry Native women, adopt Native customs, and nothing was thought of it. The Dutch in many ways were similar to the French in that they didn't have large permanent settlements with a lot of women and children. They mostly focused on trading, and largely they got along with native peoples. So, to sum up the major effects of European exploration, Europeans finally discovered the Americas and settled there. As a result, native populations were severely affected. Slavery became an important aspect of colonial life. They provided the majority of the manual labor needed to sustain the colonies after the Native Americans proved to be ineffective. The Columbian Exchange changed the landscape of both Europe and the Americas, and this led to a lot of colonial rivalries because countries each wanted their own chunk of North America. In chapters 2 and 3, we're going to be taking a look at English colonization and compare it with the French, Spanish, and Dutch. But for now, I've included a stimulus-based multiple choice question, I guess 3 questions. So I'd recommend that you stop the video to read over these, and after you've unpaused it, you'll get to see the answer.